Here is our roadmap for today's literary and geographical journey. We'll briefly cover forming the nation, look at a location-based structure, dive into the Mount Sinai anchor, and finally, connect it all back to Genesis. This is going to show us exactly how the text portrays the formation of Israel for a very unique role in the world.
To really wrap our heads around the architecture of these books, we have to start with the foundational catalyst of the entire story, the Israelites' escape. You see, the narrative begins in a remarkably dark place. The Israelites are brutally enslaved in Egypt. But within the story, this is exactly where God steps in to powerfully deliver them through the leadership of Moses. From a literary perspective, this isn't just some historical footnote. It's absolutely crucial. It's the catalyst for literally everything that follows. According to the text, this is the definitive moment where God starts forming this group of enslaved people into a distinct, organized nation with a very specific purpose. Everything we're about to look at builds directly off this initial moment of liberation.
Here is a total game changer for how we read these texts. A lot of times we think of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers as having sharp, rigid boundaries, kind of like modern chapters in a novel. But when you trace the actual journey, you see a completely different reality. The true structure holding these books together is actually based on the physical locations where the Israelites stopped. It's an ancient road trip. Every distinct location is carefully noted, and the events at each stop are vividly described, anchoring the whole narrative to the actual ground they walked on. We see them move from stage 1 in Egypt, traveling to stage 2 at Mount Sinai, pushing through stage 3 in the wilderness, all while heading toward their ultimate destination, stage 4, the land of Canaan. Once you look through the lens of these 4 geographic stages, all those chaotic lists and laws suddenly snap right into place.
Which brings us perfectly to our third section, the Mount Sinai anchor, the massive pit stop.
Mount Sinai is, without a doubt, the absolute focal point of this journey. It acts as the geographical anchor for all 3 of these books. It's so cool because the physical boundaries of the books fundamentally blur here. Get this, the second half of Exodus, the entirety of Leviticus, and the beginning of Numbers all describe what happened at this single specific location. Think about what a massive paradigm shift that is. A book like Leviticus isn't just a disconnected, floating list of ancient rules. No, it's a deep dive into the events of one monumental stop on their journey. Time essentially stands still at Mount Sinai across a huge chunk of the literature.
So the big takeaway here is that this extended pit stop was incredibly productive. It's literally where their society was built. While they were camped at the mountain, the text tells us God revealed his laws to Moses, which importantly included the famous 10 Commandments, plus God confirmed his covenant with this young nation right there at the base of the mountain. These were the foundational, identity-forming moments for them. They arrived as newly freed slaves, but the narrative uses this location to forge them into a structured, bound community with a clear set of governing ethics.
And they didn't just get laws. They also took on a massive, unified building project. They constructed the tabernacle. This was essentially a tent of meeting, and its purpose in the text is just profoundly significant. It was designed specifically so God could dwell right there among the Israelites. Just imagine the psychological and societal impact of that on a newly formed nomadic nation. Having the presence of God portrayed as literally living right in the center of their camp, that completely centralized their focus, their worship, and their daily lives long before they ever packed up to move again.
Before they finally hit the road again through the wilderness toward Canaan, these texts served very distinct practical purposes. Leviticus laid out the specific laws and regulations the Lord gave to Israel. It's basically the comprehensive instruction manual for their new societal and religious life. But then, the book of Numbers shifts the literary focus entirely. It actually reports how the people were structurally organized into a fighting force. This is a huge transition in the story. They aren't just an escaped group needing laws anymore, they're an organized, mobilized unit getting ready to face the challenges of the Promised Land.
As this fighting force moves toward their destination, the text drops these incredible literary callbacks. They act almost like hidden GPS coordinates for the reader. Take a look at this passing sentence from Numbers chapter 3, verse 1. This is the account of the family of Aaron and Moses. Now, why on earth does this simple sentence matter? Because the book of Numbers is reaching all the way back across Leviticus and all the way across Exodus to repeat the exact same phrase that structures the book of Genesis. It is a highly intentional piece of literary architecture designed to bind these separate scrolls into one continuous narrative.
And it gets even better. In a brilliant literary Easter egg, the source material notes that we actually hear this specific structuring phrase for the 12th time right here in Numbers. And guess exactly when it happens? Perfectly in sync with the moment the 12 tribes are being organized into a nation.
12 repetitions of a foundational phrase, aligning perfectly with the 12 tribes of Israel. That is just incredible. It shows the deep, intentional design woven into these ancient texts, proving this isn't just some haphazard collection of documents.
It really shows how deeply intertwined these books are from beginning to end. Near the very end of the book of Numbers, the prophet Balaam looks out over the Israelites and says, "May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed." This directly mirrors God's original, foundational promise to Abraham way back in Genesis, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." These sweeping references prove definitively that we aren't looking at disjointed, standalone stories. Together, they are intricately structured to tell a single, cohesive story of the beginning of God's redemptive work.
Seeing this massive geographical and literary structure completely flips how we read and understand this ancient literature. It proves there is a grand, sweeping design at play from start to finish, rewarding anyone willing to look just a little bit closer. So I want to leave you with this final thought today. If a single repeating phrase and a subtle geographical timeline can so beautifully link Genesis all the way through to Numbers, what other brilliant literary patterns are hiding in plain sight, just waiting to be found? Keep that in mind the next time you explore these incredibly rich texts. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.
We have to start with the ultimate high stakes, because every great narrative begins with an inciting incident, right? And here it is a truly chilling, ruthless decree from the Pharaoh. The mandate was horrifying. He ordered, "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." It's a brutal reality that kicks our entire narrative into motion. It's literally an organized campaign of annihilation. But you've got to wonder, why would a monarch issue such an extreme order against people living right inside his own borders? Well, to understand that, we have to rewind just a bit and look at a demographic shift that had him absolutely terrified.
70. That's a pretty small number, isn't it? The text describes how the Israelites originally entered Egypt as a single family unit of just 70 descendants of a patriarch named Jacob. And at that time, they were welcomed guests under the protection of Jacob's son, Joseph. But the text tells us that an entirely new king came to power, and to this new guy, the legacy of Joseph meant absolutely nothing. He looked at the Israelites and saw a massive threat. Why? Because that original group of 70 had been incredibly fruitful. They multiplied so much that the land was filled with them. So this new king gets profoundly paranoid. He's terrified that if a war breaks out, this huge immigrant population might just team up with Egypt's enemies.
So he decides to act. Pharaoh tries to deal shrewdly with the Israelites by instituting brutal slave labor. We're talking forced labor, building massive storage cities like Pithom and Ramesses under horrific conditions. He makes their lives bitter with grueling brick and mortar work and absolutely ruthless labor in the fields. But here's the fascinating twist. The plan completely backfires. The text explicitly states that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. Talk about irony, right? This resilience just makes the Egyptians deeply dread the Israelites, and it's exactly this failure to break them that pushes Pharaoh to escalate things to that horrific infanticide decree we just talked about.
But even in the face of that terror, we see this brilliantly quiet, incredibly brave rebellion right at the ground level. See, before Pharaoh ordered his entire population to throw baby boys into the river, he secretly commanded the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill the male infants right there on the delivery stool. But these midwives, they feared God way more than they feared the most powerful man on earth. They completely defied his orders and just let the boys live. When Pharaoh hauls them in and demands an explanation, they offer this incredibly clever, subversive excuse. They tell him Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. And because of their bravery, the narrative tells us God was kind to them, and the Israelite population just kept right on growing.
Zooming in on the micro level of all this survival, we meet a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi, and they happen to have a baby boy right smack in the middle of Pharaoh's throw them in the Nile decree. To save her son, the mother takes some really desperate but ingenious steps. First, she manages to hide him for 3 agonizingly long months. When she can't hide his cries anymore, she essentially complies with Pharaoh's order to put the boy in the river, but with a massive loophole. She grabs a papyrus basket, carefully waterproofs it with tar and pitch, tucks her child safely inside, and hides it among the reeds along the Nile's bank. All while the boy's older sister watches from a distance to see what's going to happen.
Now, what makes this moment so compelling is the profound, really fractured duality of our protagonist's identity. Down at the river of all people, it's Pharaoh's own daughter who discovers the basket. She hears the baby cry, feels pity, and recognizes right away that it's a Hebrew child. Then, in a stroke of absolute narrative genius, the baby's sister steps out and offers to go find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for her. And who does she get? The baby's actual mother. So the mother is now literally being paid by the royal family to nurse her own hidden son. Eventually, he's formally adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and becomes an Egyptian royal. She names him Moses, which the text says means, I drew him out of the water. So think about this. We have a hero born a Hebrew slave under a death sentence, now being raised in the very palace that ordered his execution.
As you might guess, as Moses grows up, the tension of this dual identity violently snaps. It plays out incredibly fast. On day 1, he goes out, sees an Egyptian brutally beating a Hebrew slave, checks to make sure no one is watching, and then kills the Egyptian, burying him in the sand. On day 2, he goes out again and tries to break up a fight between 2 Hebrews. But one of them snaps back at him, saying, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Boom. Suddenly Moses realizes his deadly secret is entirely public knowledge. By day 3, the news reaches Pharaoh, who immediately tries to have Moses executed. So Moses is forced to completely abandon his royal life and run for his life into the distant desert land of Midian.
So, now he's in Midian. Talk about a drastic pivot. He goes from being a prince in a palace to a fugitive hanging out by a desert well. While there, he rescues 7 daughters of a local priest from some aggressive shepherds, draws water for their flock, and gets invited in by their father, Reuel, who is also known as Jethro. Moses agrees to stay, marries one of the daughters, Zipporah, and they have a son. Moses names his son Gershom, and the reason he gives for this name is just heartbreaking. He says, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. That single statement perfectly encapsulates his profound sense of isolation. I mean, he belongs nowhere. He's not fully Egyptian, he's totally alienated from the Hebrews, and now he's just living as an alien in Midian. According to the narrative, a long period of time passes, and we hit a massive turning point on the macro level. Back in Egypt, the king who wanted Moses dead finally dies. But the oppression of the Israelites, that doesn't die with them. They continue to groan under bitter slavery. The text emphasizes this really profound sequence of cosmic reactions here. The people cry out, their cry for help goes up to God, God hears their groaning, and crucially, God remembers his ancient covenant with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The narrative tells us that God looked on the Israelites and was finally concerned about them. The stage is perfectly set for divine intervention. Meanwhile, what's Moses up to? He's just doing his daily, ordinary job. He's tending his father-in-law's flock, leading them to the far side of the wilderness, and he arrives at Horeb, which the text actually calls the mountain of God. And right there, he encounters the ultimate call to adventure. He sees an angel of the Lord appearing in flames of fire from within a bush. But there's a glaring, mind-bending paradox. The bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. It's this unconsuming fire. Moses is like, okay, I need to check this out. And when he goes over to investigate, God calls out to him from inside the bush by name, Moses, Moses, and commands him to take off his sandals because he is standing on holy ground.
From the bush, God reveals his intention to rescue the Israelites and bring them to a good, spacious land flowing with milk and honey. Then he drops the bombshell on Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh. As you'd expect, Moses is utterly terrified. He's a wanted fugitive. He pushes back hard, basically asking, who am I to do this? And then he asks, if I go to the Israelites, what do I say if they ask for your name? In response, the text provides this incredibly profound philosophical definition. God answers, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. It's a name that signifies eternal presence, self-existence, and an absolute unrivaled authority, being introduced to a people who, up until now, have only known the harsh authority of Egyptian slave masters.
But God doesn't just call Moses with a profound name. He hands him a highly specific, honestly audacious battle plan to confront the very superpower he fled from. Step 1. Moses has to go back to Egypt and assemble the elders of Israel, explaining that the God of their fathers has seen their misery. Step 2, Moses and those elders are to march right up to the new king of Egypt. Step 3, they're to make a very specific, bold demand. They have to say, let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. It's a structured, incredibly methodical approach to dismantling the chains of an empire.
Now, how do you convince a reluctant, stuttering shepherd to actually do this? You give him some massive promises.
God outlines exactly how this seemingly impossible mission is going to end. First, he promises deliverance into a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Second, God is super realistic with Moses. He explicitly tells them that the king of Egypt will not let them go willingly. It's going to require God to stretch out a mighty hand and strike Egypt with supernatural wonders to force the issue. Finally, God promises that when they do leave, they won't be empty-handed. The women are to ask their Egyptian neighbors for silver, gold, and clothing. It's brilliant storytelling. The narrative creates these perfect thematic bookends. It started with Pharaoh stripping the Hebrews of everything and decreeing death, and now God is decreeing life, freedom, and the ultimate plundering of their oppressors. And that brings us to the end of this foundational setup. Just think about it. Moses, the baby drawn out of the water, raised as a prince, who murdered a man and hid in the desert for decades, is now drafted into the most pivotal confrontation in ancient literature. This epic origin story leaves us hanging on a massive cliffhanger. Armed with a divine commission and these powerful promises from a burning bush, will the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt actually yield to a reluctant shepherd and let an entire enslaved workforce walk free? It's a conflict that changes history forever. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep exploring these fascinating ancient texts. All right, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the reluctant prophet. Second, return and confrontation. Third, bricks without straw. Fourth, a promise reaffirmed. And finally, the family record. Just listen to the deep insecurity in his words. He tells God to please send someone else. He isn't just asking for some clarification on the mission. Actually, scratch that. He is flat out begging for a way out. He explicitly complains that he's never been eloquent, that he's slow of speech and tongue. He literally views his own physical and speaking limitations as a complete disqualification for leadership. He just doesn't buy that he's the guy for the job. Now, to counter this intense reluctance, God equips Moses with 3 highly visual proofs of authority. And these aren't subtle either. We're talking about a wooden staff transforming into a living snake, a hand instantly struck with a terrifying skin disease and then healed, and a localized environmental anomaly where water turns to blood on dry ground. But incredibly, even with these jaw-dropping special effects, Moses is still hesitant. I mean, imagine arguing with the creator of the universe right after watching a piece of wood turn into a reptile. Ultimately, God agrees to a compromise, and he sends Aaron the Levites, Moses' brother, to act as his eloquent mouthpiece. And right away, we get this jarring contrast in how their message is received. On one hand, Moses and Aaron gather the Israelite elders, perform the signs, and the text tells us the people react with profound hope. They bow down and worship, so relieved that their misery has finally been seen. But on the other hand, at the palace, totally different story. They ask Pharaoh for a simple 3-day journey into the wilderness for a religious festival, and Pharaoh's response is just absolute dismissive arrogance. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? He completely rejects their premise, their authority, and their God. This rapid cascade of cruelty. Pharaoh targets the exact supply chain of their oppression. He orders the slave drivers to stop supplying straw, which is absolutely crucial as a binding agent for making bricks. But, and here's the really sinister genius of it, the daily labor quota remains exactly the same. So the people have to scatter all across Egypt just to find stubble, inevitably failing to hit their impossible targets. And, as a direct result, the Israelite foremen are physically beaten. The whole system is rigged for absolute failure. When those beaten Israelite overseers bypass the slave drivers and appeal directly to Pharaoh for some mercy, they get absolutely none. Instead, they get gaslit. Pharaoh labels their desire for a religious festival as a symptom of laziness. Lazy, that's what you are. He spins the narrative, basically telling them that their suffering is their own fault for wanting time off to sacrifice. It's a classic textbook tactic, right? Blame the victims of the system for the impossibilities of the system. So, the crucial takeaway here is this devastating shift in morale. Just days prior, the Israelites were bowing down in hopeful worship. Now, the Israelite foremen confront Moses and Aaron, viewing them not as saviors, but as the direct cause of their impending destruction. They literally accuse Moses of putting a sword in Pharaoh's hand to kill them. I mean, think about that. Moses' very first act of leadership has basically resulted in an unmitigated disaster for his people. Responds to Moses' accusation with a powerful reaffirmation of the original plan. Listen to the definitive structure of these divine assurances. It's a series of absolute, definitive promises. God repeatedly emphasizes, I am the Lord, as the ultimate foundation of these claims, and follows it up with decisive I will statements. I will bring you out, I will free you, I will redeem you, I will take you as my own people. It's a sweeping promise to force Pharaoh's hand through mighty acts of judgment. So Moses takes this incredibly uplifting divine guarantee right back to the Israelites. Yet, tragically, the text tells us they did not listen to him. And why? Because of their discouragement and harsh labor. The narrative recognizes a really profound psychological reality here. People who are utterly broken by systemic abuse, exhausted by impossible quotas, and physically beaten literally cannot even process the promise of a better future. Their trauma completely blocks out the message of hope.
Novel, it feels like a bizarre interruption. But in ancient literature, a family record is anything but random. It serves as an absolutely essential grounding mechanism. It establishes legal, historical, and authoritative credentials. Before the conflict with Pharaoh escalates into supernatural warfare, the text pauses to explicitly validate exactly who Moses and Aaron are. It's basically the textual equivalent of showing your badge before kicking down the door for a major raid. This record maps out the narrative strategy perfectly. It starts with the firstborn sons of Israel, Reuben and his clans, then Simeon and his clans. But then it quickly moves past them to focus entirely on the third son, Levi, and his 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. It's like the camera of the narrative is zooming in.
By tracing Levi's line down specifically through his son Kohath, we get to Amram. And Amram, who married Jochebed, fathers Aaron and Moses. The text is officially establishing their exact parentage, deeply anchoring their authority in the shared tribal history of the very Israelites who just rejected them.
The text makes absolutely sure there is zero ambiguity for the reader. You can hear the repetition of identity. It was this Aaron and Moses. The narrative is stamping a giant seal of approval on them. Despite the disaster with the bricks, despite the broken morale of the slaves, this specific Moses and Aaron, with this specific lineage, are the undisputed authorized agents of change. But even with his legal and historical lineage proven, and God's sweeping promises completely restated, we end this explainer exactly where we began, with a deeply reluctant middleman. Moses is instructed once again to go tell Pharaoh to let the people go. So, can a divine mandate actually overcome profound human doubt? Well, how does Moses respond? With the exact same excuse. The text concludes this sequence with Moses still doubting his own abilities, asking, "Since I speak with faltering lips, why would Pharaoh listen to me?" It leaves us with a fascinating, lingering question. How can a leader who is so profoundly paralyzed by his own perceived flaws ever summon the conviction to command a king to dismantle an empire? We really need to trace the incredibly tense standoff that led up to it. See, we aren't starting at the beginning of the story here. We are dropping right into the final, absolute, most intense acts of this ancient confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. Grasp how fast things spiral out of control? You have to realize the source text uses this really haunting motif. No matter how bad things get, Pharaoh's resolve is unnaturally stiffened. The text explicitly calls this God hardening Pharaoh's heart, ensuring that this final monumental clash is completely unavoidable. Just look at the breathless pacing of these final judgments. Things escalate so fast. First, a looming threat of locusts arriving tomorrow. Then, an immediate plunge into 3 days of total pitch-black darkness. And finally, the terrifying countdown to a promised midnight strike. The tension is palpable. It's basically an uncompromising high-stakes negotiation right before the locusts invade. Pharaoh's officials are literally begging him, saying, "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" So Pharaoh tries to compromise. He offers to let just the men go, which is clearly a tactic to hold families and livestock hostage so they'll come back. But Moses, he demands absolute, total release. Everyone, everything, no exceptions. Moses tells Pharaoh, "Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind." A pretty bold move, right? He refuses to compromise on even a single animal. Well, this absolutely infuriates Pharaoh, and the consequences are immediate. A massive east wind brings a swarm of locusts so severe the ground turns black, devouring literally whatever survived the previous disasters. And that's followed by 3 days of darkness so thick, the text says it can be felt. Finally, Pharaoh furiously banishes Moses under the threat of death. And there's some heavy dramatic irony here. Pharaoh threatens Moses with death right before the ultimate plague of death is unleashed on his own house. Which Moses accepts the banishment, but before leaving Pharaoh's presence forever, hot with anger, he delivers one ultimate terrifying warning, an impending devastation promised to hit at exactly midnight. Now, this isn't some widespread natural disaster like locusts or hail. This is a highly targeted, deeply personal strike. Notice the brutal equality of this judgment, too. It promises to hit Pharaoh on his throne just as hard as the lowest captive in the dungeon. Absolutely no level of Egyptian society would be spared.
The author then sets up this stark, dramatic contrast that just dials the psychological tension to an 11. For Egypt, the promise is loud wailing, worse than there has ever been in their history. But in stark contrast, for Israel, profound stillness, complete peace. The text vividly claims that not even a dog will bark at any person or animal. You can literally feel the clock ticking toward midnight.
Right at the absolute peak of the tension, the epic storytelling suddenly hits the brakes. It shifts gears into this gritty, hyper-detailed survival manual. These were the exact step-by-step instructions the community of Israel had to follow in order to survive the coming night. Select a perfect year-old male lamb. Slaughter it precisely at twilight on the 14th day. And, absolutely crucially, paint its blood on the tops and sides of their doorframes. Even the cooking instructions are strictly life or death here. No boiling allowed. It has to be fire-roasted, eaten with bitter herbs, and bread made without yeast.
And listen to this posture of immediate flight they're commanded to take. They aren't sitting back for a leisurely, relaxing feast. No way. The instructions command them to eat in haste, with their cloaks tucked into their belts, sandals laced up on their feet, and walking staffs firmly in their hands. They are fully dressed and ready to sprint at a moment's notice. The unleavened bread is a totally practical detail, too. There is simply no time to sit around waiting for the yeast to make the dough rise. It's basically the ultimate high-stakes fast food.
The narrative violently thrusts us back into the action. The preparations are done, the painted doors are shut tight, and the clock strikes midnight. The text describes this inescapable devastation sweeping across the entire country, fulfilling the earlier warning with terrifying precision. Just as promised, every firstborn in Egypt is struck down, including Pharaoh's own heir and all the livestock. Pharaoh, his officials, and all the citizens wake up in the dead of night. And the text notes, with chilling finality, that there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead.
However, by meticulously following those strict survival rules we just talked about, the Israelites experienced a completely different night. The text explains that the blood painted on the doorframes acted as a visual sign. When the destroyer moved through the land, it saw the blood and literally passed over those doorways. The Israelites remained completely untouched, safely huddled inside. And yeah, this is the literal defining origin of the term Passover.
This midnight strike breaks the stalemate entirely. The standoff is officially over. Pharaoh and the Egyptian people aren't just casually letting the Israelites go, they are terrified. They believe that if the Israelites stay, the rest of the country is going to drop dead. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron and demands they leave immediately. To really grasp the monumental scale of this departure, think about this massive figure, 600,000 men on foot journeying from Ramses to Sukkoth. And remember, that number doesn't even include the women, the children, a multitude of other people who joined them, or the massive droves of livestock. They left so incredibly fast, they had to carry their unbaked dough right on their shoulders. Interestingly enough, the text notes they actually plundered the Egyptians, having asked their neighbors for articles of silver, gold, and clothing before they fled. The source material really makes a point to emphasize the profound historical weight of this exact moment. 430 years. It specifically states that at the end of exactly 430 years in Egypt, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left. It frames this midnight escape not just as some random, chaotic occurrence, but as the culmination of centuries of history reaching a precise, predestined boiling point.
Now those urgent, chaotic midnight survival tactics, they were instantly codified into permanent ironclad regulations. The text lays out strict rules for what it calls a lasting ordinance. Things like the total removal of yeast from the house for 7 days, under the threat of being cut off from the community. Strict boundaries on who can even participate, requiring circumcision for foreigners and slaves who wish to join in. The absolute requirement to eat the meal entirely inside the house and to never break a single bone of the sacrifice.
It really leaves us contemplating the incredible power of this foundational text. Seriously, think about it for a second. How does a visceral, chaotic narrative of ancient midnight survival transform into a highly structured cultural celebration that endures thousands of years later? It's fascinating to see how a dramatic night of terror, high-stakes negotiation, and ultimate liberation was brilliantly woven into a continuous, living tradition that people are still practicing to this very day.
Think about it.
How do you survive a literal midnight judgment and escape a 430-year exile? It honestly sounds like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, but the source text presents this as a historical, literal survival guide. To make it through what's coming, the Israelites are given incredibly specific and frankly somewhat bizarre instructions. Every single detail matters here, and missing a step.
The text kicks things off with a total reset of time itself. Seriously, the Lord tells Moses and Aaron that this specific month is now going to be the first month of their year. It's a brand new calendar for a brand new era, and it sets a ticking clock. On day 10, every household has to select a lamb. On day 14, right at twilight, the whole community slaughters them. And from day 14 through day 21, a strict diet of unleavened bread begins. The countdown to midnight is officially on.
Now, the Israelites are handed an exact, super urgent action plan. After slaughtering the lamb, they're instructed to take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, and literally paint the sides and tops of their door frames. Just picture that visual for a second. Then, they have to roast the meat over a fire. But step 4 is where the tension really spikes. The text says they must eat this meal with their cloaks tucked into their belts, their sandals on their feet, and their staffs in their hands. They are quite literally dressed to run out the door at a moment's notice.
You have to understand, this menu, absolutely not a casual suggestion. The culinary and ritual rules were incredibly strict. The animal had to be a year-old male without defect. If your household was too small to finish a whole lamb, you had to share it with your nearest neighbor. And get this, it had to be roasted completely whole, head, legs, internal organs, the whole shebang. Absolutely no raw or boiled meat. Whatever wasn't eaten had to be burned by morning, leaving zero evidence and zero baggage behind. And crucially, it had to be eaten with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast, because there simply wasn't time to let the dough rise. Finally, a strict lockdown order is issued. No one is allowed to step foot outside their door until morning.
Actually, let's pause right here on this quote from the text. "Eat it in haste, it is the Lord's Passover." This really encapsulates the immense urgency of the moment. There's no time to linger, no time for comfort. The pacing of the text rapidly shifts gears here, moving us directly from meticulous preparation right into the dark climax of the narrative. This text reports that precisely at midnight, the Lord passed through the land of Egypt and struck down every firstborn. And the text makes it crystal clear that this was an absolute, all-encompassing event. It spanned from the highest levels of power, Pharaoh's own firstborn sitting on the throne, all the way down to the firstborn of the lowest prisoner locked in the dungeon. It even included the firstborn of all the livestock. The text frames this not just as an attack on Egypt, but as a definitive final judgment brought upon all the gods of Egypt.
This sets up a really stark contrast between two vastly different realities that night. For the protected Israelites, the blood painted on their doorframes acted as a sign. The text states that when the Lord saw the blood, he passed over that doorway, completely blocking the destroyer from entering. But for the unmarked houses of the Egyptians, the text describes a devastating scene. Pharaoh, his officials, and all the Egyptians woke up in the middle of the night and a loud wailing erupted. Why? Because as the text explicitly notes, there was not a single house without someone dead.
And this total devastation completely breaks the will of Egypt's ruler. In a desperate, middle-of-the-night surrender, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron in the pitch black and commands them, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go, worship the Lord as you have requested." He even tells them to take all their flocks and herds, and in a really stunning final moment of defeat, asks them to bless him on their way out.
Okay, so the Egyptians were terrified. The text actually says they urged the Israelites to hurry up and leave, fearing that if they stayed, all of Egypt would die. The visual details the text gives us here are striking. The Israelites just grabbed their dough before any yeast could be added, literally carrying their kneading troughs wrapped up in clothing right on their shoulders. And incredibly, following Moses' earlier instructions, they simply asked the Egyptians for silver, gold, and clothing. The text notes the Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed to them, meaning they essentially plundered the wealth of their oppressors just by walking out the door, baking unleavened loaves of bread as they traveled.
430 years. The text goes out of its way to emphasize this exact length of time that the Israelite people had lived in Egypt. It wasn't some slow, gradual departure. At the end of those 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt.
And the sheer scale of this exit, it is absolutely immense. The text states that as they journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth, there were about 600,000 men on foot. Now, to put that into perspective, that staggering number doesn't even include the women, the children, the many other people who went up with them, or the massive droves of livestock. The logistical shock of packing up and moving that many people and animals in a single night is almost impossible to wrap your head around. It was an exodus of literal epic proportions.
It's honestly fascinating to see how trauma and survival get codified into tradition here. The Festival of Unleavened Bread is established as a 7-day commemoration. To honor the Lord keeping vigil that night, the Israelites are commanded to remove all yeast from their houses. So the modern-day requirement to eat unleavened bread serves as a literal, physical memory of their ancestors being driven out of Egypt with absolutely zero time to let their bread rise.
And listen, the text does not take this commemoration lightly. The penalty for non-compliance is severe. Whether you're a native-born Israelite or a foreigner living among them, if you eat anything with yeast in it during these 7 days, you will be cut off from the community of Israel. It is a strict, zero-tolerance policy. Now, beyond just the bread, the Passover meal itself gets these strict, ongoing regulations for future generations. Like, the meat has to be eaten entirely inside the house. Not a single piece of meat can be taken outside. On top of that, none of the animal's bones are to be broken. And it's a communal requirement. The whole community of Israel is obligated to celebrate it together.
The chapter then ends by drawing some very strict boundaries around participation. Basically, who gets to sit at the table. The dividing line, according to the text, is circumcision. Native-born Israelites, circumcised slaves, and residing foreigners who have had all the males in their household circumcised are allowed to partake. Once circumcised, the exact same law applies to the native-born and the foreigner alike. But temporary residents, hired workers, and any uncircumcised males, they are strictly barred from participating.
See, in this command from Moses, he says, "Commemorate this day, the day you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." It's just an incredible hook, right? The text doesn't wait for, a 10-year reunion to establish historical memory. It demands it at the exact moment of liberation. They're commanded to look at their present, messy reality and instantly file it away as a sacred, historical milestone.
How exactly does the text demand they remember all of this? Well, through some incredibly strict physical rituals. The first major symbol is the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Just look at the specific stipulations laid out. It has to occur right now in the month of Aviv, and it lasts for exactly 7 days. During this time, they're told to eat bread made entirely without yeast, which then culminates in a festival to the Lord on the 7th day. And the text is completely uncompromising on this last point. Absolutely no yeast is to be seen anywhere within their borders. Period. By forcing this really strict dietary act, the physical reality of their hasty departure, meaning leaving so fast they literally couldn't even wait for their bread to rise, serves as this continuous, tangible reminder of what they went through.
And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast the text is trying to build for us. On one side, we have Egypt, which is defined starkly as the land of slavery. But then look at what they're moving toward. The text describes the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites as a land flowing with milk and honey. That is a massive visual and sensory contrast. They're moving from severe oppression to incredible abundance. And these rituals, they're meant to be observed once they actually reach that abundant land, making sure they never ever take their new freedom for granted.
The source material actually goes even further to show just how deeply these observances should be felt. It says this observance will be like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead. The goal here is for the law of the Lord to be continuously on their lips. So they aren't just, celebrating a random holiday. These acts are designed to be so totally ingrained in their daily existence that they function almost like physical marks on the body. It's like an ancient, tactile version of a constant push notification reminding them to never forget.
Let's move forward and see how this builds, because now we reach the ultimate symbol of memory presented in the text. God tells Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal." Wow, that is a heavy, absolute claim. The text is literally tying the very continuation of their families and their livelihoods directly to the memory of their liberation.
Which brings us to a crucial concept found in verse 13, redemption. Now, to redeem basically means to exchange or buy back. The text mandates that they must redeem every firstborn among their sons, and similarly, they have to redeem a firstborn donkey with a lamb. But what happens if they choose not to do this? Well, the text is shockingly stark here. You must break its neck. The absolute severity of this rule really underscores just how serious this symbol of memory is meant to be.
Now, what I absolutely love about this text is its brilliant, built-in pedagogical framework. It literally anticipates the curiosity of the next generation. It prompts, in days to come when your son asks you, "What does this mean?" The text doesn't just lay down a dry law. It establishes this incredibly dynamic educational system.
It shows how historical memory is designed to be transmitted generationally, directly from parent to child, using these odd, striking rituals to provoke inevitable questions.
And when that inevitable why finally comes from the kid, the text provides a dramatic, pre-written script. The parent is instructed to look at them and say, "With a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." The explanation then continues, detailing that when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let them go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is the harrowing why behind the ritual. They sacrifice and redeem their own firstborn to commemorate exactly what it cost to break Pharaoh's stubbornness.
So, the crucial takeaway here is how the text hammers this point home. Look at this motif. With a mighty hand. If you read through the source carefully, this exact phrase is repeated 3 distinct times. That is definitely not an accident. It's a rhythmic emphasis firmly underlining divine power. It ensures that the Israelites remember not just that they left, but specifically who brought them out.
All right, let's shift gears and look at part 2, the physical departure.
Now that we know what they were commanded to remember, let's look at how they strategically left. The text outlines a really fascinating geographical decision. On one hand, you have the road through the Philistine country. It's a much shorter, much more direct route. But on the other hand, you have the desert road toward the Red Sea, which is vastly longer. God purposefully chooses not to lead them down that shorter road. Let's unpack why.
What's genuinely fascinating here is the deep psychological insight it reveals. The text actually gives us God's internal reasoning for avoiding that shorter route. If they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. It is a stunning acknowledgement of the Israelites' vulnerable mindset at that exact moment. Sure, they might be physically free, but they are not yet psychologically resilient enough to handle a war. The fear of battle might literally drive them right back into the arms of the people who enslaved them.
Yet despite God routing them away from immediate war to protect that fragile resolve, the text makes a very specific point to clarify their posture. It says the Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. So they didn't just scatter into the desert in some chaotic, disorganized mob. They left prepared, organized, and totally in formation.
And right in the middle of this massive logistical movement, we get this incredible historical detail. Moses actually takes the bones of Joseph with him. Why? Well, because generations prior, Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath, prophesying, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place." It is a profound full circle moment for them. Even while in the middle of their chaotic physical escape, they are already practicing what we talked about in part 1. They are carrying the physical memory of their ancestors with them into the future. Let's track this physical progression real quick. First, they officially break out of Egypt. Then, totally bypassing the short route, they push down the long desert road toward the Red Sea. They leave Succoth behind, and finally, they make camp at Etham, poised right on the ragged edge of the unknown desert. As they hit the edge of that desert, the text introduces a beautiful contrast in how they are led forward. They are provided with a literal, divine guidance system. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night, a pillar of fire to give them light. This incredible duality meant they weren't restricted by the setting sun. They could travel continuously, whether it was day or night. And the text leaves us with this powerful image to close out the narrative of their initial departure. The pillars never left their place in front of the people. Whether it was the cloud by day or the blazing fire by night, there was a constant, unwavering presence leading them out of slavery and into the great unknown. So I want to leave you with a thought to tie this whole thing together. We see that their physical journey required a constant, highly visible guide, a pillar of cloud and fire, just to keep them moving forward safely. But consider this. If a purely physical journey requires such a profound guide, how much more does a newly free people require those strict symbols of memory, like the unleavened bread or the redemption of the firstborn, to prevent their minds and hearts from returning to the past? True liberation, it seems, requires us to constantly remember the cost of our freedom.
Actually grasp the stakes of this ancient text, we've got to start right in the thick of the panic. The Israelites are completely trapped between an ocean and an approaching army, and how do they respond? With some incredibly dark, sarcastic humor. They literally ask Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" I mean, wow. It's such a fascinating look at human nature, right? Even thousands of years ago, staring down an impossible, terrifying situation, people used heavy sarcasm as a defense mechanism. Something's never changed.
Really wild about this text
It's how methodically it sets up the trap. It's this deliberate geographic snare designed to make Pharaoh think the Israelites are just wandering around completely lost. And guess what? The bait works perfectly. Pharaoh suddenly realizes what he's done and regrets losing his free workforce, yelling, "What have we done? We have lost their services." This causes him to mobilize an absolutely overwhelming military force. We're talking 600 of his very best chariots, plus literally all the other chariots in Egypt, complete with officers. To put that into perspective, in the ancient world, that's essentially the equivalent of deploying an entire superpowers armored tank division against a group of fleeing civilians on foot. The mismatch here is just staggering.
And see, this brilliantly illustrates the narrative contrast in leadership. On the one hand, you have the sheer despair of a trapped people. The Israelites are practically begging, "Leave us alone. It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than die here in the desert." They are just completely broken by the visual threat of those chariots bearing down on them. But then on the other hand, you have Moses. He issues this incredibly resolute, calm command. Do not be afraid, stand firm. He tells them the Lord will fight for them, and all they have to do is be still. It's this profound, almost shocking demand for stillness right in the face of roaring chaos.
The climax of the story, I want you to notice something. Before a single drop of water even moves, the narrative introduces this fascinating duality. The angel of God and the pillar of cloud actually move physically to come between the two camps. This one single pillar acts as a barrier, doing two completely opposite things at the exact same time. It brings pitch darkness to the pursuing Egyptian army, basically blinding them, while somehow providing light to the fleeing Israelites all night long. It is just a brilliant literary device to really highlight separation and divine protection.
Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is that this mystical, miraculous event, it's actually described as a highly procedural sequence. It doesn't just happen in a sudden flash of light. The text breaks it down into 4 distinct physical steps. First, Moses raises his staff and stretches his hand out over the sea. Second, a strong east wind drives the sea back all night. Third, the sea turns into dry ground. And fourth, the waters physically divide, forming literal towering walls of water on the right and on the left. The narrative really grounds the divine intervention in these tangible physical elements: wind, ground, and water.
By mapping all this out chronologically, the text builds incredible gripping tension. Think about it. All through the night, this intense wind is blowing. Then, during the last watch of the night, that darkest, most bone-tired time right before dawn, the Lord throws the Egyptian army into total confusion. He literally jams the wheels of their chariots. They realize they're fighting a divine force and desperately try to retreat. But it all culminates right at daybreak. As the sun finally comes up, the waters flow back. The timing of it all is just cinematically precise.
And then the climax ends with this incredibly chilling, brief sentence: "Not one of them survived." Pharaoh's entire army is swept into the sea. And it's the absolute finality of this victory that causes the Israelites to instantly shift their mindset. They go from terrifying panic and throwing sarcastic remarks at Moses to seeing the mighty hand of the Lord. Suddenly, they shift to fearing the Lord and completely trusting in Moses. The trap was sprung, but on the pursuers, not the pursued. Talk about a plot twist.
Right here, the narrative actually hits us with some sudden structural whiplash. It completely pauses the intense, blow-by-blow historical action we've been tracking, and it delivers this exalted, sweeping piece of ancient poetry known as the Song of Moses and Miriam. And what's really captivating here is the visceral, rhythmic imagery used to celebrate the destruction of Pharaoh's best officers. The text says, "The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone." The poetry focuses heavily on gravity, right? On the weight of the water and the inescapable sinking of an empire's massive pride.
But then, notice how the poetry sharply contrasts that heavy imagery. Right after comparing the enemy to sinking stones, it says, "You unleashed your burning anger, it consumed them like stubble." Now think about the difference between a heavy stone and stubble. Stubble is flimsy, it's dry, and it just vanishes in a flash of fire. The song is brilliantly emphasizing that, sure, the Egyptians were this heavy, terrifying military machine to the Israelites, but against divine power, they were as lightweight and instantaneous to destroy as dry grass.
Now, it is absolutely crucial to point out that this wasn't just a solo performed by Moses. The text specifically highlights Miriam, the prophetess. She grabs a timbrel, and all the women follow her lead with more timbrels and dancing.
This cements the moment as a deeply communal, intensely physical act of musical worship. It's a massive, joyous celebration of an entire people who just literally watch their oppressors vanish.
Massive cinematic climax of poetry and joyful dancing, the story takes its most relatable and honestly, perhaps its most tragic human turn. It abruptly grounds the characters straight back into the harsh, gritty reality of desert survival. It's been just 3 days. Literally 3 days after the greatest rescue in their history, the brutal reality of traveling in the desert of Shur without finding drinking water leads the people straight back to their old habits. They start grumbling against their leadership, they complain to Moses, "What are we to drink?" It's like the spiritual high of the Red Sea just evaporates the second their physical thirst kicks in. And, well, it's a pretty honest portrayal of human fragility, don't you think? They finally do find water, but oh man, it's a crushing disappointment. The location is called Mara, which literally translates to bitter, simply because the water there is completely undrinkable. What an absolutely perfect poetic metaphor for the rapidly shifting mood of the camp, right? Their joy has turned bitter right alongside their water supply.
And once again, just like at the Red Sea, a massive crisis is solved through a very specific, physical, divine procedure. Moses cries out, the Lord points out a piece of wood, Moses throws that wood into the water, and boom, the toxic water becomes completely sweet and perfectly fit to drink. The narrative is basically repeating its pattern here: immense danger, human panic, a physical intervention, and then a divine rescue. But right here at Mara, the text makes a crucial pivot. This really sets the stage for the rest of their journey. See, God doesn't just heal the water. He issues a ruling, an instruction, and a test. It's essentially a conditional promise. He tells them that if they listen carefully, do what is right, and obey his decrees, they won't suffer the diseases brought upon the Egyptians. The dynamic of their relationship is shifting from a passive rescue mission to an active covenant that requires obedience.
As the Israelites finally make a safe, refreshing camp at Elim, a place with 12 springs and 70 palm trees, by the way, we are left to ponder this ancient text's underlying cyclical message. I really want to leave you with this question to think about. Why does the ultimate divine rescue almost immediately give way to a rigid test of obedience? Perhaps the text is suggesting that escaping oppression is really only the first step. The much, much harder journey is learning how to be a free people bound by a higher law.
Thanks for watching.
Stay blessed and don't forget to share this video with everyone.